The main difference between a DSLR camera and a mirrorless camera is that when you look through the viewfinder of a DSLR, you are seeing the raw light that's coming through the lens. You just see the framing, the depth of field, and the focus. But with a mirrorless camera, you see much more. On top of the framing, depth of field, and focus, you also get to see the exposure overall, what effect the shutter speed will have on the resulting image, and also the overall dynamic range of the photo. And for this reason, you can easily look through the viewfinder of a DSLR, see that it looks amazing, take the photo, and it can look completely different to what you saw through that viewfinder. And I've made this mistake way more times than I'd like to admit. One of the best things about mirrorless cameras is what you see is what you get. But outside of the fact that you can actually see your exact exposure in a mirrorless camera, are they actually better than DSLR cameras? In what ways are they better? And have mirrorless cameras actually killed the DSLR? All right, first up, let's talk about image quality. And in terms of image quality, I have found that there is very, very little correlation between sharpness, color accuracy, and color depth between DSLR cameras and mirrorless cameras. And when it comes to image quality, it's more about the actual sensor that's inside the camera than whether it's a DSLR or a mirrorless. So here's two test photos with the same framing. Obviously it's a different lens. That's probably going to be the biggest factor here, is the lens that you put in front of that sensor. And the image quality on both is really great. You got the same sensor size, so you're getting the same depth of field as well. One thing you might notice that's gradually gotten better over the years in terms of image quality is actually the dynamic range. And especially if you're a landscape photographer, someone who edits their photos a lot, pushing and pulling the tones from highlights to shadows, then you might notice that cameras that have come out recently do have higher dynamic range on average. So dynamic range is how much detail in the brightest whites and the darkest shadows the camera can actually capture. And this is highly dependent on the sensor as well. Cameras like the 5D Mark III, which is the DSLR that I own, are notoriously bad for shadow recovery. You can recover next to zero detail from the shadows if you underexpose. Whereas the Nikon D800, a camera that came out at a similar time, has legendary shadow recovery. You can totally underexpose your images and still be able to pull back some of that detail. So it is really dependent on the sensor. But in general, I would say that over time, cameras have just gotten better in terms of their dynamic range. And this is especially true for Canon cameras. They really did step up their game when it came to the generation starting with the 5D Mark IV. So some of the biggest pros when it comes to a mirrorless camera, and we already touched on a few of these, are obviously that you can see your exposure in real time, which means no chimping. And chimping is where you take a photo, look at the screen, take a photo, look at the screen. You're like constantly checking your exposure and making sure that everything looks right. The on-sensor autofocus system from the mirrorless cameras enables all sorts of things like subject recognition, eye tracking, and just more autofocus points in general. Especially in the video shooting use cases, having these autofocus modes is really helpful. Lens choice as well, particularly brand new out of the box lenses. A lot of the lenses for DSLRs are being discontinued now. They're stopping the production of them and favoring production of mirrorless lenses. So you do have quite a lot of choice when it comes to brand new lenses for mirrorless cameras. So when you have all these awesome features of mirrorless cameras, why would you consider buying a DSLR in 2023? Probably one of the biggest ones for me is price. A lot of people are moving away from DSLRs and upgrading to mirrorless cameras, and so that has really driven the price down in the used market, and you can really pick up a bargain on a professional level DSLR. Arguably, DSLRs are more ergonomic because the size and weight of mirrorless cameras has really come down. They don't need that big mirror box as well as the pentaprism at the top of the camera. You can really compact the cameras down, and a lot of them now, they tend to be very small and dinky, whereas DSLRs are like big hunks of metal. They're great to grip onto and they just feel really nice in the hand. I would argue that DSLRs are better to learn photography on. They're just a lot more simple. There's a lot less menu options. I just think it's really great to learn on a platform that just doesn't do everything for you, if that makes sense. Lenses and the price of lenses. This goes back to my point before about the price of DSLRs getting cheaper. Because people are moving away from DSLR, they're also selling the lenses. So that means there are so many really high quality lenses on the used market that you can jump straight into and start making really beautiful images for a really affordable price. Obviously, you want to do your due diligence and make sure you're buying high quality used gear. And as long as it's been looked after well, then you should be fine. And last of all, not so much a tangible point, but but it just feels really good to shoot on a DSLR. It does simplify the shooting process a little bit. There's not all those bells and whistles like mirrorless cameras have. Not as much as a film camera simplifies it. That is like really bare bones, but I guess you get the point. Alright, so with all that out of the way, let's talk about using a DSLR and a mirrorless camera side by side in the real world. My friend Gerard and I did a shoot recently, and I actually challenged him to use the DSLR for the entire shoot while I used my mirrorless camera. And this was really interesting because Gerard actually started on a mirrorless camera. He's never actually used a DSLR in like a professional setting. So I thought it'd be really interesting to get his take on it after using the DSLR for the day. And so I gave him my old beat up 5D Mark III and a 50mm 1.8 lens. We both used 50s. These were his thoughts on using the 5D Mark III for the day. What are the first things you noticed?
Okay, well, instantly this 5D doesn't actually have the decal here, so I don't know if I'm aperture priority or manual mode. There's a bunch of like covers missing.
I've used and somewhat abused this camera over the years as like my main working camera, so yeah, it's usually in a lot better condition if you buy a new one and actually look after it.
And just shooting on the camera, the autofocus is pretty good. Like, it's a lot faster than my film camera. I also shoot that in one shot. We're shooting on one shot today. I'm using aperture priority. The menu system was really intuitive. You know, I could just figure it out pretty easy compared to Sony's. So formatting the card, setting up the minimum shutter and stuff like that, aperture priority worked easy. The screen on here kind of sucks. Like, Mitch was telling me that it is a very magenta and blue cast, and it just looks like my white balance is fully off. We are shooting in RAW, so I could just fix that in post in Lightroom. So I'm really interested to seeing the photos on the computer compared to the back of the screen here. Also, this is a DSLR, so that means that I can't see my true or live exposure. So basically I have to take a photo, check my exposure, adjust my exposure, take another photo, and then hopefully get the right exposure and then continue to shoot. So compared to my mirrorless camera, I can literally just use the EV compensation and live view and just bang on a whole lot of shots without even having to check my exposure. So that's definitely something to consider when using this 5D. And also, this camera is massive and it's so heavy. Like, I can't imagine having like a 24-70 L series on here as well. That'd be a pretty heavy setup. So yeah, like, this mirror must be made of lead or something. I don't know.
Okay, let's talk about video really quickly, because if you are in the market for a camera that's going to be doing photo and video, you will probably notice that not a lot of DSLR cameras have really great video features. Some of them do, but they tend to be the more expensive ones, whereas mirrorless cameras, for the most part, so many of them have amazing 4K quality video with really great autofocusing systems. So I would say if video is really high on your list, maybe a mirrorless camera might be better. But if you're strictly a photography shooter and you have no interest in video, then DSLR might be the way to go. Time for some final thoughts. So it is said way too often, and I bet that you're probably expecting me to say this, but what you put in front of the camera is 99% of the reason of what makes a photo good, not the camera that you're using. I've seen photos taken on 40-year-old film cameras that completely blow away anything that I've taken on a camera from 2023. But that's not to say that the camera isn't important at all. You have to find something that works for you, it's comfortable for you, and that doesn't get in the way. It doesn't disrupt your photo creating process. But you know, some people will argue that this camera from 2012 has better skin tone and just looks nicer than anything that's come out recently. And ultimately, I can see how it's kind of subjective as well. The particular camera that I have, the 5D Mark III, does have a bit of a legendary reputation for portrait and wedding photographers just because it's so reliable. It's literally a workhorse. Plus, you can't argue, the photos straight off this camera, even in today's standards, still look really beautiful. That being said, I've routinely seen this camera as well as the older Mark II version going anywhere from $300 to $350 US on the used market, which in my opinion is a bit of a bargain. So for someone who's a beginner, they're looking for a workhorse camera, something that's gonna be with them for the next 3 to 5 years, I really can recommend picking up a DSLR. It's reliable, it's sturdy, it has all-day battery life. a really great selection of lenses. Just be aware of some of the drawbacks that obviously come with a DSLR, the limited dynamic range being one, and just shoot accordingly. And if you're serious about photography, this camera could pay itself off in as little as like 1 to 2 paid photo shoots, which is pretty awesome. So I want to say a big thank you to Gerard for helping out with this video and sharing his thoughts for you guys. I thought it was really insightful to get his opinion, given that he started out on mirrorless and he's never really had that experience with a DSLR. So I'll leave his details linked below. He also has a YouTube channel that you guys should definitely check out. So let me know in the comments down below, do you guys shoot on a DSLR or a mirrorless, and why? I'd love to hear your opinions. Appreciate you guys for sticking around once again, and I'll see you in the next video.